Ötzi the Iceman has been dead for approximately 5,300 years, and his skin still carries 61 tattoos. Not painted on, not scarred in, not smudged pigment sitting loosely on the surface. Tattooed, in the strict technical sense, with pigment worked beneath the surface of the skin using a sharpened tool, exactly the way tattoos are made today. This is not a marginal curiosity buried in a footnote of archaeological literature. This is one of the best preserved human bodies ever recovered, frozen in a glacier in the Alps, and it is covered in permanent ink applied with deliberate technique by someone who knew precisely what they were doing. The story of ancient tattooing is not the story of primitive people accidentally discovering that soot rubbed into a wound leaves a mark. It is the story of a sophisticated, independently invented technology that appears on nearly every inhabited continent, developed by cultures with no contact with one another, using remarkably similar tools and techniques for reasons that turn out to be considerably more complicated and more interesting than most people assume. Let's go through it properly. Start with the basic mechanics, because the story of ancient tattooing is substantially the story of how you get pigment to stay permanently under skin that is constantly shedding and regenerating itself. This is not a trivial engineering problem. The outer layer of skin, the epidermis, replaces itself every few weeks. Any pigment placed only in this layer would vanish within a month. For a tattoo to last a lifetime, the pigment has to be deposited in the dermis, the layer beneath, which does not shed and regenerate in the same way. Ancient practitioners across unrelated cultures independently solved this exact problem using tools that share a common underlying logic, even when the specific materials differ enormously. The tools fall into two broad categories that show up again and again across the archaeological and ethnographic record. The first is the puncture method, using a sharp point, a bone needle, a thorn, a fish spine, a sliver of obsidian, to push pigment directly into the dermis with repeated small punctures. The second is the incision method, cutting a shallow line into the skin and then rubbing pigment into the open wound so that it heals in place, leaving a permanent mark. Both methods appear independently in the archaeological record on multiple continents, which is itself a striking piece of evidence. When separate populations with no contact between them arrive at the same two basic solutions to the same mechanical problem, it suggests the solutions were not culturally transmitted, but discovered through the same process of trial, error, and observation of what actually works on human skin. The pigments used were similarly consistent across unrelated cultures. Carbon-based pigments, usually soot from burned wood or oil lamps, were overwhelmingly the most common choice, and this is not a coincidence. Soot is abundant everywhere fire is used. It is chemically stable once embedded in skin, and it produces a strong, dark, long-lasting mark. Ötzi's tattoos were made with soot. Tattoos found on Egyptian mummies were made with soot. Tattoos documented among Polynesian, Inuit, and Amazonian peoples were made with soot, sometimes mixed with plant ash or animal fat to help the pigment bind and reduce irritation during healing. Across cultures that never met, that spoke unrelated languages, and that developed independently for tens of thousands of years, humans kept arriving at the same practical chemistry. Now let's talk about the evidence, because this is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. Tattoos require preserved skin, and preserved skin is rare. This means the tattoo evidence that has survived represents an enormous underestimate of how widespread the practice actually was in the ancient world. Most tattooed bodies decomposed completely, taking any evidence of the practice with them. What survives is a narrow, accidental sample from unusually dry, cold, or otherwise preservative environments, and even that narrow sample shows tattooing on every inhabited continent. Ötzi, found in the Ötztal Alps in 1991 and dated to roughly 3,300 BCE, carries 61 tattoos arranged mostly in lines and crosses along his lower back, legs, and one wrist. What makes this discovery particularly significant is the placement. The tattoos cluster around joints known to suffer from degenerative wear. An analysis of Ötzi's remains shows he had arthritis in exactly these locations. This has led many researchers to propose that at least some of his tattoos were therapeutic, a form of ancient pain management applied directly to afflicted joints, functioning in a manner strikingly similar to acupuncture, a practice that would not be formally documented in written form for thousands of years afterward. If this interpretation holds, it means tattooing and medicine were entangled from among the very earliest examples we have physical evidence for. Egyptian mummies provide a second major line of evidence, and one that overturned assumptions that had persisted in archaeology for decades. For a long time, tattoos found on Egyptian female mummies were assumed to indicate low social status, associated with dancers, or what earlier excavators characterized with considerable bias as women of ill repute. More recent and more careful analysis has undermined this assumption substantially. A mummy discovered at Deir el-Medina, dating to sometime between 1300 and 1070 BCE, bears tattoos, including the Eye of Horus and other explicitly religious and protective symbols, positioned on parts of the body associated with fertility and childbirth. The tattoos were not incidental decoration. They appear to have functioned as protective and possibly medical symbols, connected to the dangers of pregnancy and delivery in the ancient world, worn by women who were likely engaged in ritual or healing practice, rather than by women of low standing. Beyond Europe and Egypt, tattooing shows up independently across an extraordinary geographic range. Tattooed mummies from the Chinchorro culture in what is now Chile date back over 4,000 years. Tattooing among Pacific Island cultures, particularly in Polynesia, developed into some of the most elaborate and socially significant tattoo traditions documented anywhere, with designs that encoded genealogy, rank, and personal history across the entire body. Tattooing among the Inuit of the Arctic used a technique involving pulling a soot-covered thread beneath the skin with a needle, an entirely distinct mechanical approach from puncturing or incising, arrived at independently in one of the most isolated environments humans have ever inhabited. Ancient tattooing among indigenous peoples of North America is documented through early European accounts and through preserved tattooing tools found at archaeological sites, including bundles of sharpened implements clearly designed and maintained for this specific purpose. This geographic spread matters enormously for understanding what tattooing actually represents. This is not a technology invented once and spread through trade and contact, the way something like bronze metallurgy moved across connected regions. Tattooing appears to have been invented independently, over and over, by populations with no possible means of learning it from one another, separated by oceans and by tens of thousands of years. When a technology this specific, this mechanically non-trivial, keeps appearing independently across the species, it suggests something close to a universal human impulse rather than a cultural accident that happened to spread widely. Now let's talk about why, because the reasons ancient humans tattooed themselves turn out to cluster into a small number of recurring categories that show up again and again across cultures that had no contact with one another, which is itself informative about what tattooing was actually doing for the people who practiced it. The first category is medical and therapeutic. Ötzi's case is the clearest example, but it is not isolated. Ethnographic accounts from multiple tattooing cultures describe tattoos applied specifically over areas of chronic pain, and the placement pattern, clustered at joints and along pathways associated with pain rather than scattered decoratively across the body, supports a genuinely medical rather than purely aesthetic function in at least some cases. Whether the mechanism involved any real physiological effect, something resembling the stimulation involved in acupuncture, or whether it functioned through belief and ritual meaning, or some combination of both, the intent behind the placement is unmistakable. The second category is protective and spiritual. Tattoos functioning as a form of protection, warding off illness, misfortune, or malevolent spiritual forces, appear across an enormous range of tattooing cultures. The Egyptian tattoos, connected to fertility and childbirth, fall into this category. So do tattoo traditions across parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, in which specific symbols, geometric patterns, animal forms, sacred text fragments were believed to confer protection on the wearer. In cultures without modern medicine, without a scientific framework for understanding disease or misfortune, a permanent mark believed to offer ongoing protection represents a genuinely reasonable response to a world full of dangers that could not otherwise be controlled or explained. The third category is social and identity-based, and this is where tattooing connects most directly to the broader pattern of ancient cosmetic body modification, body painting, piercing, scarification, and the use of ochre pigments that shows up in the archaeological record as far back as roughly 100,000 years ago at sites in South Africa. Polynesian tattoo traditions represent perhaps the clearest and most extensively documented example of this function. Traditional Polynesian tattooing, from which the modern word tattoo derives, through the Tahitian and Samoan word tatau, encoded genealogy, status, achievement, and group membership directly onto the body in ways that were immediately readable by anyone within the culture. A person's tattoos told the story of their lineage and their life. This was not decoration in the modern casual sense. It was a permanent, visible, socially legible record, applied through a process that was itself often long, painful, and treated as a significant rite of passage. The fourth category, closely related to the third, is status and rank. In numerous tattooing cultures, the right to bear certain tattoo patterns, or the right to bear tattoos at all, was restricted by social position. Elaborate tattooing among some Polynesian societies was concentrated among chiefly lineages. Among some indigenous groups of North America and Siberia, specific tattoo marks indicated achievements in hunting or warfare that had to be earned before they could be worn. The tattoo functioned as a permanent credential, one that could not be faked, borrowed, or removed, which is precisely why it carried social weight that a temporary decoration could not. Now let's talk about the actual technique in more physical detail, because the skill involved in producing ancient tattoos is consistently underestimated by people who assume the practice must have been crude simply because it is old. The puncture method, used with bone or thorn needles, required controlling both the depth of each puncture and the amount of pigment deposited with each strike. Puncture too shallow, and the pigment does not reach the dermis and fades or vanishes entirely as the skin regenerates. Puncture too deep, and the wound bleeds excessively. Pigment gets washed out during healing, and the risk of infection increases substantially. Getting this consistently right across dozens or hundreds of individual punctures required practiced, controlled technique, not random jabbing. Some traditions developed genuinely sophisticated tools to manage this problem. Tattooing implements recovered from Pacific Island sites and still used within living tattooing traditions today employ a small comb-like head made from sharpened bone, shell, or turtle carapace teeth, mounted at a right angle on a wooden handle. The practitioner does not push this tool directly into the skin by hand. Instead, a second handle is used to strike the mounted head repeatedly, tapping the row of sharpened teeth into the skin at a controlled, consistent depth with each strike. This two-person, two-tool method allows far greater control over depth and rhythm than hand-pushing a single needle, and it produces the dense, precise geometric patterns characteristic of traditional Polynesian tattoo work. This is not a crude technology. It is a purpose-built mechanical system for solving a specific problem in controlled pigment deposition, refined over countless generations of use. The Inuit thread-pulling method represents an entirely different mechanical solution to the same underlying problem. A needle, carrying a length of sinew or thread coated in soot, is passed beneath the surface of the skin, and the thread is drawn through, depositing pigment along the entire length of the puncture channel in a single motion rather than through repeated individual punctures. This method is faster for producing continuous lines than puncture tattooing, and it represents a genuinely distinct engineering approach to the same fundamental challenge, arrived at independently in an environment about as far removed from the Pacific Islands as it is possible to be while remaining on the same planet. Now let's talk about skill and transmission, because tattooing, like other forms of specialized ancient craft, was not something every member of a community could do well. Ethnographic accounts of living and recently living tattoo traditions consistently describe tattooing as a specialist role, one occupied by particular individuals within a community who trained for years under an experienced practitioner before being permitted to work independently on other people's skin. In Polynesian tattooing traditions, the tattooist held a distinct and often highly respected social position, and the transmission of technique, of pattern knowledge, and of the ritual protocols surrounding the practice moved from master to apprentice across generations in a manner directly comparable to the transmission chains documented for other specialized ancient crafts, stone tool production, midwifery, or navigation. A young apprentice needed to learn not just the physical technique of controlled tapping or puncturing, but an entire vocabulary of patterns, each carrying specific genealogical or symbolic meaning that had to be applied correctly and appropriately for the person receiving the tattoo. This transmission mattered because errors were permanent and could not be corrected in the way a mistake in weaving or pottery could be unpicked or reshaped. A tattoo applied with the wrong pattern, wrong placement, or poor technique remained on the recipient's body for the rest of their life. This raised the stakes of the apprenticeship considerably higher than in many other crafts, and it likely reinforced the social status and long training period associated with skilled tattooists across multiple, unrelated tattooing cultures. Now let's talk about pain, because this is a dimension of ancient tattooing that deserves direct attention rather than the vague acknowledgement it usually receives. Every method of ancient tattooing, puncture, incision, or thread pulling, involved repeated, sustained injury to the skin, often across large areas of the body, using tools without any form of anesthesia. Traditional Polynesian tattooing sessions, covering large portions of the body, could extend across multiple days, with the recipient experiencing sustained pain throughout the entire process. This was not incidental to the practice. Some accounts describe recipients being expected to remain silent or motionless through hours of sustained puncturing, with visible pain or interruption of the process treated as a genuine social failure rather than a reasonable human response to injury. In many cultures, the ability to endure this pain without visible distress was itself part of what the tattoo was meant to demonstrate. The tattoo was not only a permanent mark, it was evidence that the person had undergone and endured a significant physical ordeal, which is precisely why tattooing so frequently functioned as a marker of status, maturity, or achievement rather than purely as decoration. The endurance and the mark were inseparable parts of the same social signal. There is one more piece of evidence worth addressing directly, because it reframes the entire timeline of the practice. Ötzi is often described as the oldest tattooed body ever found, but this framing is slightly misleading, and correcting it matters. Ötzi is the oldest tattooed body found with skin still intact enough to examine directly. The Chinchorro mummies of the Atacama coast, deliberately preserved through an intentional mummification practice that predates Egyptian mummification by roughly 2,000 years, show evidence of body modification consistent with a long tradition of marking the skin and ochre use associated with body decoration in the archaeological record stretches back tens of thousands of years further still. This distinction between the oldest tattoo we happen to have physical evidence for and the oldest tattoo that ever existed is not a minor technicality. It means every date attached to ancient tattooing should be read as a floor, a confirmed minimum, rather than an actual point of origin. The true history of the practice almost certainly extends further back than any surviving skin can demonstrate, into a period from which no soft tissue evidence could possibly have survived at all. Now let's talk about what happened as metal tools became available, because this transition followed a pattern with an interesting parallel to other ancient technologies. Metal needles did not immediately or automatically replace bone, thorn, and shell tools everywhere metal became available. In many tattooing cultures, traditional tools remained in use for generations after metal was accessible for other purposes, in part because the traditional tools were already extremely well suited to the task, and in part because the tools themselves and the specific techniques associated with them were bound up with the cultural and ritual meaning of the practice. Changing the tool was not a neutral technical upgrade. It risked changing the meaning of the tattoo itself. In several documented Polynesian tattooing traditions that have continued into the present day, traditional bone and shell tattooing combs remain in active use specifically because practitioners and recipients consider the traditional method essential to the cultural authenticity and meaning of the tattoo, even when metal alternatives are readily available and, in a narrow technical sense, easier to use. And this is ultimately what the story of ancient tattooing reveals. It reveals a practice driven by medical, spiritual, and social motivations that emerged independently across populations with no contact with one another, using tools that differ in specific material but converge again and again on the same underlying mechanical solutions to the same underlying problem of permanent pigment placement beneath living skin. The tools were bone, thorn, shell, and soot, rather than the electric machines and sterile ink of a modern tattoo studio. The skill required to apply a tattoo well was concentrated in specialists who trained for years, exactly as it is today. But the fundamental act, a permanent mark deliberately placed beneath the skin to heal, protect, signal status, or commemorate an achievement, is one of the oldest continuously documented human practices we have physical evidence for, appearing on a frozen body in the Alps, more than 5,000 years old, on mummies wrapped in Egyptian linen, and on the skin of living practitioners today, who still tap bone combs into flesh exactly as their ancestors did. The tattoos on Ötzi's arthritic joints were not an approximation of medicine. Applied by someone who understood, through whatever combination of observation and inherited practice, that a mark placed at the site of pain seemed to help, they were, by the measure that actually matters to the person receiving them, medicine. And whether they were applied for pain, for protection, for status, or for the simple desire to be marked permanently as belonging to something larger than themselves, the people who wore them clearly believed the mark, and the ordeal required to earn it was worth carrying for the rest of their lives.